What's up, everybody? You are listening to the Credentials Unscripted podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sterenberg, and we've got another phenomenal episode for you today. This is episode 37, and we're talking with Dr. Annelies Goger from the Brookings Institution about bridging the gap between education and labor. Obviously, a lot of conversations around this. She comes at it from a research perspective, and she's done a lot of work studying states and how they're trying to bridge this chasm that exists where employers are looking for top talent. They're concerned about retaining that talent. And then ultimately, how are we preparing students for that level of work in higher ed? And she makes the point that we've got a lot of great apprenticeships for kind of older industries, but we don't have the same type of model for newer industries like cybersecurity. So how do we think about work-based learning? How do we think about experiential learning? How do we invest in apprenticeships and basically have more blended pathways rather than thinking about, okay, I complete higher ed, now I go into the workforce. How do we start to blend these a little bit better and have better engagement between employers and higher ed institutions? And in many ways, the states need to adopt this work. So great conversation. Hope you enjoy it. I think that you will. And without further ado, let's get to our conversation with Dr. Goger. Here we go. Dr. Annelies Goger, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So I want to dig into one of your papers that you wrote, how U.S. employers and educators can build a more nimble education system with multiple paths to success. It's a great read. You released it last May. Everything in it still feels very relevant. And I'm just going to start off with a quote from it because I think it's really good. And I would just love to hear your response to get us started here. A growing chasm between the education system and labor markets in the U.S. is making it harder for employers to find and retain qualified talent, and it also is stunting the career and education options for Americans without a college degree. Doesn't sound like good news, Annelies. So tell me a little bit more about this paper, how it came to be, and give us the summary of what you tried to tackle in it.
Sure. It really emerged from a lot of conversations I had in my project with Alabama, Colorado, and Indiana about scaling earn and learn opportunities. One of the biggest barriers to scaling those opportunities is the lack of engagement and adoption from employers, particularly outside the skilled trades, where things like apprenticeship have been common for decades. When you get beyond those fields, like modern industries like tech or healthcare or cybersecurity is a good example where you really need hands-on skills to do it well, but we don't have institutions that do that in a formal way all the way up to like master's or PhD level, which we're going to need as AI and quantum computing expand. We need more people that have much more expertise, but also know how to apply it in specific industries, whether it's finance or healthcare or whatever. And I think that we focused so much for so long on just send everybody to college and classroom learning as the ticket to opportunity. I think that we really need multiple pathways into those opportunities, and some of them should be more hands-on. But in those hands-on pathways, if we're going to say, become a cyber expert at the master's level, you can't build that pathway without much more engagement from employers and from the people in particular sectors that need those skills. And the current higher ed ecosystem really doesn't have like a framework or a mechanism to incorporate employer input in a really like strongly employer-driven way for those hands-on pathways. So what we start to see is that it takes 2 years to approve a higher ed accredited program, and you might have an employer advisory committee. Who knows who sits on that? But there's not really, it takes a long time, and then by the time it's approved, it may be out of sync with where the industry's at. And so I think we need a lot more of a responsive setup for especially those fields where employers are more heavily engaged when you're doing hands-on work-based learning. And so we wrote the paper to think through, what are the pain points that employers are having when they try to engage and provide feedback to this system, to the education system as a whole. And so that's kind of where our thinking came about. I did it with Katie Caves from ETH Zurich, who's an expert on vocational and professional education systems globally. Switzerland is where she's based, but she's American. So I feel like she can bring some interesting third-party perspectives to that. And then Hollis Salwe used to work at CareerWise USA and Reach University, so she brings also some great perspective working on the ground with employers. So together we kind of ideated on what are the pain points that employers have and how do we think about this not just as one particular problem, but actually like several layered issues that are kind of built into our institutions that are generating this chasm between employers and education systems.
One of the interesting points you make is, given the state of our country, it's like the states really need, and I don't mean that in any sort of political thing, but it's just the power often sits at the states in order to make these changes with state universities, colleges, and just they have the governance in order to make some of these changes. Tell me about what you learned from the states that you studied, Indiana, Alabama, and Colorado. What did you learn from how they were able to make meaningful change in these areas?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. The site of action needs to really focus on the states just because of how our federalist structure works. Every state is so different in terms of how its higher ed system is set up, how employers engage with that. And so, in looking at these three states, what was really interesting to me is that they were all really committed to expanding apprenticeship and work-based learning, but they took completely different ways of doing that based on like how their state operates. And so you see in Colorado, it's a really heavily local control state. So you see tons of innovation, especially at the local level, where they're doing super creative things in multiple arenas. But where they struggle is, having an overarching vision at the state level for how to scale those innovations. Like it's hard to go from, pilot program in this place to statewide system. And so it creates somewhat of a competitive dynamic between these different innovative strategies rather than an overarching vision where they all play a role. I'll go to Alabama next, which is the opposite, I would say, where you had a lot of innovation coming from the governor's office, right? From the top down, like really thinking about, like, we want to build systems that connect people based on skills. So they did this talent triad, where they're really trying to use skills as the currency that connects employers and learners, and also that higher ed could step into for like, okay, what are the gaps here? What do we need to train people to do? And that's super innovative. I haven't really seen that kind of comprehensive focus on skills-based connection in the labor market. But then, like, their challenge is how do you get that deployed? How do you get buy-in from the employers in particular sectors? How do you get learners to, really market themselves based on their skills and not just like kind of fall back on a traditional resume per se? So that's kind of where they were coming at their reforms. And then Indiana sort of in the middle of those two, where a lot of the impetus for reform was coming from this sort of intermediary organizations, employer-led intermediate organizations, that were really thinking about how do you take innovation on the ground and push it up to the state and like bring it all together. And so I wanted these three states to engage with each other to see what they could learn from, even though they're not going to necessarily copy and paste from each other, but how do you think differently about like what you could be doing to kind of learn from these states that have different strengths. And so I guess what I'm saying is reform needs to be focused at the state level, but in the long run, we also have to think about what states can learn from each other and how they can also sort of have a shared vision of where we're going. Because in the end of the day, if you have a really different way of doing this, like in terms of like what is the outcome of an apprenticeship, like or whatever. If that means if a cybersecurity apprenticeship doesn't mean the same thing in Indiana that it means in Alabama, that's also problematic because it it devalues that credential, right? And so we do need to have some national standardization of even what these terms mean. What is an internship versus apprenticeship? What is a youth apprenticeship? What is a pre-apprenticeship? There's all these confusing terms, and if we don't have some national standardization of what it means, then you start to get really confused when you're trying to move between states or understand what somebody's training actually means as an employer. So it's a bit of a combined national versus state, but at the end of the day, the reform really has to focus at the state level with some national role there as well.
Yeah, I think the ability for it to mean something across state lines is incredibly valuable. We've seen this on other credentialing sides where a state system gets built and they love their system. Oh, let's send this transcript as data, for instance. And it's like the minute that you try to send it out of state, it doesn't have the same amount of value. And it's like these walled gardens that we build. And part of that is intentional, right? Like we want to keep and retain talent here. So let's just focus on what we do. And we actually had Nick Moore on the podcast a few months ago. So if anybody's listening and they're like, I want to learn more about the Alabama story, Nick dives deep into the talent triad and everything that they've done in Alabama. But I love that you're highlighting these states as laboratories. What can we develop and how do we make it work? But the response has been, and you highlight this in your report, we have a wild west of non-credit credentials, right? So the response has been less formal programs and more so on skills. How do we communicate skills? And you highlight that employers are really kind of confused about these new forms, non-credit, alternative credentials. How do those fit into the national qualification frameworks or a skills framework that you're proposing?
Yeah, so when we say things like non-credit, first of all, it's one of my pet peeves is that word in general it already is undervaluing those things because it's something that is a not something. And so I've argued that we need to not just put everything in one bucket
Yeah.
and call it a not something.
Isn't that
Um,
funny that it's like, it could be it's basically like, even though it's not officially on your higher ed record, we're calling that out. It's a really funny thing, to your
it's
point, to be able to
yeah.
say, hey, it's not a lot of things. We don't need to name everything, so
Right, and
yeah.
you're lumping like a 6 week, certificate in with like a 4 year apprenticeship, which like
Right.
it's
And
the
it's also like
same.
not yet for credit because a lot of
Yeah,
people are working on, prior
right.
learning or work-based learning. Like, how do we eventually get this for credit? It's not yet for
Yeah.
credit, but maybe it could be by some institution.
Right. So what I think we need to do is first we want to have some space for, innovation where somebody's trying something outside the formal system that is novel and hasn't yet been recognized by all the powers that be as learning. We do want to have non-formal education. We always have that. But what I think we're missing here is that what we haven't been trying to do is bring things like work-based learning, things like learning that happens outside the classroom or maybe through the military or maybe through volunteering or, even the Girl Scouts or something like that. Those types of learning have meaningful value for employers, and we don't recognize that in our systems, and that's a really big problem. So a qualifications framework is basically an umbrella tool that helps you create overarching categories for different types of learning, whether it's classroom only, more theoretical on the one hand, or more applied and practical and hands-on in a workplace. Or it could be a combination of the two where like an apprenticeship blends some client time in the classroom ideally with some time in the workplace, and then you're kind of getting benefited of both worlds. Um, a qual framework makes these distinguished, make these distinctions between these types of learning, but also makes distinctions about the level of learning. So you have, your very entry level training, which what we might call non-credit training, but then you get, at a higher level, you might have, what is the high school diploma equivalent across these? In some countries, when you do an apprenticeship, your diploma kind of indicates that you have your high school diploma, but it was through a more hands-on applied pathway. And then at the next level, what we might call community college associate degree, what is that level in an applied sense, in a hands-on environment? And then at a bachelor's or a master's or higher. And so, how do you set equivalencies? And it's important, really, for a lot of reasons. But one is that when you only say everybody go to college and then everything else is a non degree credential, it erases those levels and just lumps it all together. And it makes it hard for someone, as you were kind of referring to before. Like, let's say you did a nursing assistant credential, and now you're working as a nursing assistant, but really you want to be a nurse, or really you want to be a radiologist, right? You you cannot easily move from what you have in your CNA license into a nursing program because you took it through a non-degree pathway, and that sets people up to fail. And so I think if a qual framework could, have a defined pathway where maybe you start with that CNA, but then the next stage is that you become a medical assistant, and then the next stage you choose between, this more specialized path or that specialized path, and eventually you achieve a higher level. That gives people a way to, maybe they spend some time in, gaining experience as a CNA but they have low wages because those are pretty poorly paid jobs. But that's a stepping stone. And then the next step is a little higher, and the next step a little higher. Rather than what we have now, where you do it non-credit, and then you're told, oh, well, you have to go and retake this class in the credit side of that community college. Oh,
which
and
is totally demotivating.
yeah, and then,
Yeah.
oh, well, you better do it at this schedule because that's when it's offered, but you can't because your work schedule changes every week. So you have all these barriers to moving along and achieving your goals. And what do people do? They tend to leave the profession, and then, you got to get a whole new crop of CNAs in the door. And that creates this dead end cycle. And so the qual framework would provide basically the architecture, that you need to say, okay, you're here at this level. You don't have to start all the way at the bottom again if you pivot to an approved accredited program on the academic side. And likewise, you can switch at any level, ideally, which the Swiss folks would call permeability, right? You don't want to track people into the point where they can't change their mind, or if, the field changes or your life changes, you can't pivot and get credit for what you already did. And I think the qual framework helps create that architecture, like just kind of categories of things so that you can make sense of what you already have and where you need to go next if you want to achieve your goal.
I've heard of it called on ramps and off ramps too. And the what you're highlighting, the framework, you highlight that it's a map. And I
Right.
love this analogy because everyone goes, oh, a map, great, pathways. How do I go from here to here? But you make the point of a map is great, but if you can't navigate it, you don't have a car, or you don't have a means to go through it. So it's not just creating the frameworks, it's also giving people, like, let's say we have the framework built. There's no programs offered for me in my area. I can't actually complete it. So it does take resources. We need to commit to it. We need to make sure that everybody's bought in terms of programmatically executing and reaching the people that want to do that navigation, I think is a completely underrated part of the story, right? We can build the framework, right? And agree to it. But how do we actually get people on their journey is a whole different challenge.
Right. And to me, that's a huge challenge because what we've funded through federal resources so far, you have this bifurcation where you get a lot of entry level trainings that are short term. and then there's not much in the middle, and then there's degree programs. And what you see on the ground is that in a particular community college, you'll have this siloed situation where you have all your like non-degree credentials in this side of the house is the term that they use, and then your credit programs on that side of the house, and never the two shall meet. Like, how do you get people from that more applied segment into the degree? It's seen as like a separate thing. And that's really, and not just separate, but unequal, right? One is more heavily funded and the other isn't. And one is recognized for credit and one isn't. And so I think that it really, we really, if we want to create opportunities and recognize that people learning in the workplace is a valuable thing that employers need, then I think we need to really rethink that separation.
The last episode, we had Beth Merenstein on from Central Connecticut State University. She's doing a lot of work with experiential learning. And one of the things we highlighted too was the value of work-based learning, experiential learning, take away the preparedness part, and like employers really want these types of experiences. But from the learner's perspective, being exposed to these things early in terms of the on-ramps and off-ramps, like, oh, it turns out I actually don't like being a nurse. Like, how are we going to know that unless we give people these experiences? It's almost like you're gradually ramping up into these experiences rather than I have to enroll in this program. It doesn't take anything I did into account. It's creating these binaries where it makes it difficult for students to switch and navigate. And how do you know what you want to do if you don't have any apprenticeship work-based learning and you haven't been exposed to it? Like, we joked around that in college, I was like, I worked, but it was like I worked for my dad's company. I was like, I have no idea what real jobs are. I was like,
Yeah.
what is a business degree? I honestly have no idea what it tangibly means.
Yeah.
And we do this in secondary ed, right? We try to get you in the classroom as early as possible so that you get exposed to whether or not you like kids or not. We do it in some industries, but in others like cybersecurity, or it's like, I want to go into marketing. Be like, do you really? Do you know what marketing is?
Right.
And how do we expose you to these experiences early on?
Yeah, I like to call that the experience gap. So people talk about the skills gap, but I think if you really are concerned about the skills gap, what you should be concerned about is the experience gap, because you learn skills through experience predominantly. Some of those skills you learn in the classroom, but you apply them in the workplace. And so I think that we are doing not just learners a disservice by not exposing people to that experiential learning earlier, but also employers, because employers really benefit from, you know, getting young talent out into their workplace and giving their fresh perspective on what they're seeing. And sometimes it's funny, like I talk to employers that have hosted apprentices and they've rotated them through different stages of the company or whatever, and because they're seeing it from soup to nuts, and the individual employees might be in just one piece of the company, sometimes they come up with solutions that the employees never would have come up with because they're looking at it from fresh eyes. They're sort of looking at the whole system and saying, well, why is it done this way? And that can actually bring value to the company. And I think that culture of learning and the culture of new perspective, we have Gen Z folks that really want to get their hands into things and don't want to wait like another 4 years before they get out into the real world. And I feel like why aren't we meeting that need and that demand? Why aren't we giving people that chance to get out and like see what cyber looks like? Maybe they do it in finance and they realize like finance isn't their thing, but healthcare might be more interesting. Or maybe their parents say, we want you to be a doctor, and then they go into the hospital and they're like, you know what, like I kind of want to be a PA instead of a doctor, a physician's assistant, right?
Yeah,
Like,
all the doctors I work with yelled at me. I think
yeah.
I would rather, yeah.
Yeah, and I'd rather like less schooling and less like paperwork and insurance company stuff and more time with the patient. Okay. So it's like those kinds of things where we have to question the conventional wisdom about, what you would tell your kids to do to be successful. Oh, be a lawyer or a doctor. Maybe that doesn't fly anymore. Maybe we have to give people a chance to experiment and get out there and talk to people and figure out where they gravitate to. And that helps them decide where to go to college if they want to go to college, or it helps them decide if college really isn't for them and they want to do something more hands-on. And so on the one hand, I think we need to close that experience gap. On the other, we need to, really formalize some pathways in that applied experiential learning so that if you do pursue it, it's not like a separate thing from education. It's part of education.
Yeah, and you've got a great, I guess, infographic in your report that shows kind of the traditional model, the blended model of how we can actually stop thinking about, I don't know, like basically I feel like we hold it sacred, the higher ed experience of like, you're going to go for 4 to 6 years and now it's your time to go out into the real world. And other countries don't view it that way. Like you share the example of Switzerland and how it's, I'm going to school, I'm working, it's a blended model, they have partnerships together or collaboration. But I do think there's a little bit of this higher ed, this 4 years is sacred, and
Yeah.
then it's your time to go out. This isn't, I have no research to back this up, but just, I think there is a sense of that. And I think higher ed, not all institutions, I think there's some institutions that care passionately about connecting and creating credentials of value. But I think there's others that might say, yes, we want our students to get a job, but it's not our responsibility in a sense. Like we're developing them kind of broadly, which I do think is important. I don't think we should
Yeah.
just train you for your next opportunity. I think there's a lot of value in having a broad-based education. But the whole idea here is how do we create partnerships and have a different level of ecosystem? And I wonder if there's going to be some folks in higher ed that would push back of just saying, listen, our job is to educate broadly. We don't work for IBM. Our job is not to fill their talent pool in a sense, even though we want our graduates to be employed, obviously.
Yeah, and I think there is a culture of, sacred, a cultural experience of going off to college and having that college experience. And I think that that's important. I agree. I think that we do need like especially we need our brightest minds to have access to some of the most cutting edge theory, the cutting edge thinking and problem solving and analytical abilities that you can get. And our higher ed system is one of the best, if not the best in the world for
It's our greatest
developing that.
export,
Yeah, it is.
right?
It's
Yeah.
critical for innovation. It's critical for being on the cutting edge. Um, and what I'm arguing is not to get rid of our academic uh, spaces where that magic